You are on HOA Storytime Central. The tow hook was inches away. I am standing in my driveway in Salt Lake City, Utah, staring at a bright orange tow warning sticker plastered across my windshield, and Susan Martinez is already screaming at me from the curb. She is waving a boot clamp key like it is a badge of authority and telling me my car is going to the impound lot in 20 minutes because I violated the Iron Gate Winter District Village Association snow emergency parking rules. I tell her I shoveled my walk yesterday and my car has been parked in my own driveway the entire time, not on the street. She just laughs and says the notice was already approved and the truck is on its way. I moved to this neighborhood 2 years ago because the rent was cheap and the commute to the warehouse was under 15 minutes. I work as a forklift lead and I cannot miss overtime, especially not during peak season when every shift counts double. The HOA here is aggressive, but I figured if I kept my head down and followed the rules, I would be fine. That lasted until this winter, when Susan took over as social committee chair and started treating every snowflake like a personal insult. She sends group emails like public shaming posters, complete with photos of driveways and accusations that read like criminal indictments. The first time I got one, it was because my snow pile was 6 inches too close to the curb. The second time, it was because my shovel left a ridge of compacted snow on the sidewalk. This time, she is claiming my car is blocking emergency access, which is insane because it is parked in my own driveway 20 feet from the street. My elderly father is staying with me for the month because his heater broke and the repair is taking forever. He has a bad heart, and the stress of constant HOA threats is making everything harder. Every time Susan shows up or sends another email, he gets anxious and asks if we are going to get evicted or sued. I keep telling him it is fine, but honestly, I am not sure anymore. This morning, I woke up to find the tow warning and 3 missed calls from a number I did not recognize. When I called back, it was the tow company saying they had an authorization from the HOA to remove my vehicle for a snow emergency violation. I told them I was parked in my own driveway and there was no violation. The dispatcher said she was just following the work order and I needed to take it up with the association. I pull the sticker off my windshield and walk to the curb where Susan is standing with her clipboard. She has a stack of printed photos in her other hand and keeps waving them at me like they are evidence. I ask her what emergency access I am blocking, and she says my driveway placement creates a blind spot for the plow truck and my car needs to be moved immediately. I tell her my car has been in the same spot for 2 days and the plow already came through twice without any issue. She just smiles and says the violation is not about the plow, it is about the snow pile I created when I shoveled, which is now a slip hazard on the public sidewalk. I look at the sidewalk. It is clear. There is no ice, no pile, nothing. I tell her that, and she says the hazard was documented yesterday before I fixed it, so the fine still applies. She hands me a printed notice with a list of charges. $200 for improper snow placement. $150 for failure to maintain a clear pedestrian path. $300 for unauthorized parking during a declared snow emergency. I ask her when the snow emergency was declared, because I never got an email or a notice. She says it was posted on the community board at the clubhouse and sent in the weekly digest. I tell her I do not go to the clubhouse and I did not get the digest. She shrugs and says ignorance is not an excuse, and if I do not pay the fines within 72 hours, the account goes to collections and they will file a lien. I can put you on the agenda and keep you there, she says, smiling. That is when I realize this is not about snow. This is about control. I take a photo of the notice and the sticker with my phone. I ask her who authorized the tow, and she says the board approved it at an emergency session last night. I ask for the meeting minutes, and she says they are not public yet. I ask for the name of the tow company, and she says it is already on the sticker. I look at the sticker again. There is a company name and a phone number, but no authorization code, no case number, nothing that looks official. I tell her I am going to call them and cancel the tow, and she laughs and says the truck is already dispatched and I will be charged a cancellation fee if I try to stop it. Then she turns and walks back toward her car, waving the boot clamp key over her shoulder like she just won something. I call the tow company again. This time I get a different dispatcher. I explain that I am parked in my own driveway and there is no legal basis for the tow. He puts me on hold, then comes back and says the authorization came from the HOA management company and they were told the vehicle was abandoned in a fire lane. I tell him that is a lie. My car is in my driveway and I can prove it. He says he will note my objection, but the truck is 10 minutes out, and if I want to contest it, I need to contact the HOA. I hang up and call the management company. The answering service says the office is closed for the weekend and I can leave a message. I leave a message. Then I call my neighbor Greg, who is a retired police officer and has been dealing with Susan longer than I have. Greg answers on the second ring. I tell him what is happening, and he says Susan has been running a vendor collusion scam for months. She has a preferred towing contractor and a preferred snow removal contractor, and every time there is a snow event, she manufactures violations, so the vendors get paid, and she gets kickbacks in the form of free snow clearing at her own house. He says he has been documenting it but has not had enough proof to take to the board yet. I ask him if he can come over and be a witness, and he says he is on his way. 5 minutes later, I see the tow truck coming down the street. It is a flatbed with a winch and a driver wearing a reflective vest. He pulls up to my driveway and gets out with a clipboard. I walk over and tell him the authorization is fraudulent and he is not touching my car. He looks at me, looks at the clipboard, then radios someone. A minute later, Susan is walking back up the street with her phone in her hand. She tells the driver to proceed with the tow and ignore me. The driver asks if I am the registered owner, and I say yes. He asks if the car is currently blocking any emergency access or fire lane, and I say no, it is in my driveway. He looks at Susan and asks her to confirm the location of the violation. She points at my driveway and says the vehicle is creating a hazard by forcing pedestrians into the street. The driver looks at the sidewalk, which is clear, then looks back at Susan and says he needs a signed authorization from the property owner or a law enforcement officer before he can tow a vehicle from private property. Susan says the HOA is the property owner under the covenants. The driver says he still needs a signature or a police report. Susan says she will call the police right now and report me for obstruction. The driver just shrugs and says he will wait. Greg pulls up in his truck and parks on the street. He gets out with a folder under his arm and walks over. He introduces himself to the driver and says he is a resident and a witness. Then he turns to Susan and says she needs to provide documentation that my car is violating a specific ordinance or HOA rule, and that the rule was properly noticed and enforced. Susan says the rule is in the covenants, and everyone agreed to it when they moved in. Greg asks her to cite the section number. She flips through her clipboard and says it is Section 12, subsection 4. Greg opens his folder and pulls out a copy of the covenants. He flips to Section 12 and reads it out loud. It says residents must keep driveways and walkways clear of snow and ice within 24 hours of a weather event. It says nothing about parking, nothing about emergency access, nothing about towing. Greg looks at Susan and says the rule she is citing does not exist. Susan turns red. She says the emergency session last night amended the rules, and the new version supersedes the covenants. Greg asks for a copy of the amendment and the meeting minutes. Susan says they are being drafted and will be available next week. Greg says that is not how amendments work. Any change to the covenants requires 30 days notice, a membership vote, and a filing with the county. Susan says this was an emergency and the board has the authority to act immediately. Greg says no, they do not, and if she proceeds with the tow, I can sue the HOA and the towing company for conversion and trespass. The driver hears that, looks at his clipboard, then tells Susan he is canceling the job and leaving. Susan starts yelling at him, saying she will report him to his supervisor and get his company blacklisted. The driver just gets in his truck and drives away. Susan turns to me and says this is not over. She says I am going to get an amenities lockout notice by Monday and I will not be able to use the pool, the gym, or the clubhouse until the fines are paid. I tell her I do not use any of those things, so go ahead. She says fine, then I will get a lien notice and the association will foreclose on my house. I let her threaten a lien, because that threat would look terrible on the record. Greg writes down everything she just said, time-stamped and signed, then hands me a copy. Susan storms off, yelling something about how I will regret this, and I just stand there feeling like I won a round but knowing it is not over. The temperature is rising briefly, and I need to capture the melt pattern before it changes, because if the ice refreezes tonight, she is going to claim I created a new hazard and start the whole thing over again. I spend the next 2 hours documenting everything. I take photos of my driveway, my car, the sidewalk, the street, the curb, the snow piles, and the melt lines. I take screenshots of the weather forecast and the HOA email digest, which does not mention any snow emergency. I pull up my security camera footage and download the clips showing my car parked in the same spot for the last 48 hours, the plow truck passing by twice without stopping, and Susan walking up to my car yesterday afternoon and sticking something on the windshield. I clip that section and save it in 3 places. Then I call Greg and ask him to come back over so we can review everything together. He shows up with a laptop, and we spend another hour building a timeline. Dates, receipts, weather screenshots, and photos. Everything is clean, organized, and ready to send. Monday morning, I get an email from the management company. It says my account has been flagged for multiple violations, and I am required to attend a compliance hearing on Wednesday night. The email lists the same charges Susan gave me, plus 2 new ones. Unauthorized modification of common area landscaping, which I guess means the snow pile, and failure to respond to HOA correspondence, which is absurd because I responded to every email they sent. The email also says if I do not attend the hearing, the board will proceed with enforcement actions including fines, liens, and legal proceedings. I forward the email to Greg and ask him if he can attend as my witness. He says yes, and he is bringing his own evidence. Tuesday afternoon, someone tampers with my snow stakes. I have 6 reflective stakes along the edge of my driveway to mark the curb line so the plow does not tear up my asphalt. When I come home from work, 4 of them are bent over and 2 are missing. There are fresh footprints in the snow leading from the street to my driveway and back. I check my security camera and see Susan walking up around noon, kicking the stakes over, then pulling 2 of them out and throwing them into the snowbank across the street. I download that footage too. An hour later, I get another email from the management company saying I am being charged with damaging HOA property because the plow driver reported hitting a reflective stake in the roadway and bending his blade. The email says the repair cost is $800 and it will be added to my account. I call the management company and tell them I have video proof that Susan vandalized my stakes and threw them into the street. The receptionist says she will pass my message along. Wednesday night, I show up to the compliance hearing at the clubhouse with Greg and a folder full of evidence. The board president, 2 other board members, and Susan are sitting at a table in the front of the room. There are about 10 other residents scattered in the chairs. The president opens the hearing and says we are here to address multiple snow-related violations on my property. He reads the list of charges and asks if I have anything to say. I stand up and say yes, I have a lot to say, and I have evidence that every charge is fraudulent. Susan interrupts and says I am wasting everyone's time and the violations are documented and verified by a licensed contractor. I ask her which contractor. She says the snow removal company the HOA uses for common areas. I ask for the contractor's report. She says it is confidential. Greg stands up and says confidential reports are not admissible in a compliance hearing under Utah HOA law, and if she does not produce the report, the charges are unsupported. Susan pulls out her stack of printed photos and waves them around. She says the photos prove I created a hazard and failed to maintain the sidewalk. I ask her when the photos were taken. She says Sunday morning, right after the plow came through. I pull out my phone and show the board my security camera footage from Sunday morning. It shows my sidewalk completely clear at 6 a.m., the plow passing by at 6:30 without leaving any debris, and Susan walking up at noon and dumping a shovel full of snow from her own driveway onto my sidewalk, then taking photos with her phone. The room goes silent. One of the board members asks to see the footage again. I play it 3 more times. The board president looks at Susan and asks her to explain. She says the footage is doctored and I am lying. Greg stands up and says the footage has metadata proving the date and time, and he has additional footage showing her vandalizing my snow stakes on Tuesday. If you are enjoying this wild HOA drama, please like and subscribe for more stories. The board president asks to see that footage too. Greg pulls out his laptop and plays the clip. It shows Susan kicking over the stakes, pulling 2 out, and throwing them into the street. Then it shows the plow truck coming through an hour later and swerving to avoid the stakes, not hitting them. The board president looks at Susan and says the plow driver lied in his report. Susan says the driver did not lie, he just made a mistake. The board president says a mistake that cost me $800, and he wants to know if Susan told the driver to file a false report. Susan does not answer. Another board member asks if she has any other evidence to support the charges. Susan says the charges are valid because multiple residents complained about my snow piles. The board president asks her to name the residents. She says they asked to remain anonymous. Greg says anonymous complaints are not valid grounds for enforcement under the covenants. The board president looks at me and asks if I have anything else to add. I pull out the timeline Greg and I built and hand copies to the board. I walk them through every date, every email, every notice, every photo. I show them the weather screenshots proving there was no snow emergency declared. I show them the covenant section proving the parking rule does not exist. I show them the tow company dispatch log proving Susan lied to the driver about my car being in a fire lane. I show them the email from the management company proving I responded to every piece of correspondence. Then I show them the footage of Susan placing the tow warning sticker on my windshield herself. The board president stops me and asks me to play that clip again. I do. It is clear as day. Susan walks up to my car, looks around, pulls a sticker out of her coat pocket, peels off the back, and slaps it on my windshield. Then she takes a photo with her phone and walks away. The room erupts. 2 residents start yelling at Susan, asking her how long she has been running this scam. Another resident says she got a tow warning last month and paid $300 to make it go away. Another says she got fined for ice on her walkway that she knows she cleared. The board president bangs his hand on the table and says the hearing is over and the board will reconvene in private session. He tells me the charges are dismissed and I will not be fined. He tells Susan to leave the room and not contact me or any other resident about violations until further notice. Susan tries to argue, but the board president cuts her off and says if she does not leave, he will call the police. Susan grabs her clipboard and storms out. The rest of the residents start clapping. Greg shakes my hand and says that was the most satisfying thing he has seen in years. Thursday morning, I forward the evidence to the HOA attorney and watch the tone change instantly. The attorney calls me within an hour and says the board is taking immediate action to investigate Susan and the towing contractor. He says I will receive a formal apology and a refund of any fees I paid, even though I did not pay any yet. He also says the board is considering emergency policy changes to prevent this from happening again. I tell him that is great, but I want to know what happens to Susan. He says that is a personnel matter and he cannot discuss it, but she is suspended from all committee duties pending the investigation. I ask him about the plow driver who filed the false report. He says the snow removal company is being dropped and the HOA is pursuing reimbursement for the fraudulent repair charge. Friday afternoon, Susan shows up at my front porch with two people in reflective vests and clipboards. She says they are here to conduct a safety inspection of my property, and I am required to let them in. I ask her who authorized the inspection. She says the board did as part of the investigation. I call Greg and put him on speaker. He tells Susan that no inspection was authorized, and if she does not leave, I can call the police for trespassing. Susan says the inspection is required under the covenants. Greg asks her to cite the section. Susan flips through her clipboard and says it is Section 18. Greg says Section 18 is about architectural modifications, not safety inspections, and even if it applied, the board would need to give written notice at least 72 hours in advance. One of the people in the reflective vest asks Susan if this is legal. Susan says yes, of course it is. The other person asks to see the authorization letter. Susan does not have one. Both people take off their vests and walk away. Susan stands there for a minute, staring at me, then says I will make an example out of you so everyone learns. Then, she leaves. Saturday morning, I get a call from the gate technician who services the neighborhood entry gate. He says he was walking up to my house yesterday to check the keypad when he heard Susan yelling at me and decided to wait. Then he heard her threaten me and saw her people leave. He says he has been servicing the HOA for 3 years, and Susan has been pushing him to red tag properties that do not have violations, so her preferred contractors get called in. He says he refused, and she tried to get him fired. He is willing to testify about it if I need him. I thank him and tell him to send me a written statement. He emails it to me an hour later. It is detailed, dated and signed. I add it to the evidence folder. Monday morning, the management company sends out a mass email saying the board has scheduled an emergency meeting for Wednesday night to vote on new snow enforcement policies. The email says all residents are invited to attend and comment. It also says Susan has resigned from the social committee effective immediately. I forward the email to Greg and ask him if he is going to the meeting. He says yes, and he is bringing printouts of every fraudulent notice Susan sent over the last 6 months. He has been collecting them from other residents and building a case. He says the board needs to see the full scope of what she was doing. Wednesday night, the clubhouse is packed. There are at least 40 residents in the room, plus the board, the management company rep, and the HOA attorney. The board president opens the meeting and says they are here to address systemic problems with snow enforcement and vendor oversight. He says the board conducted an internal review and found multiple instances of improper notices, unauthorized towing attempts, and vendor collusion. He says the review is ongoing and criminal referrals are being considered. Then he opens the floor for comments. One resident stands up and says she was fined $200 for ice on her walkway that she cleared twice. Another resident says he was towed from his own driveway and had to pay $400 to get his car back. Another resident says she got an amenities lockout notice because she questioned a fine, and it took 3 months to get it reversed. Greg stands up and says he has documentation of 15 separate incidents where Susan fabricated violations or coerced vendors into filing false reports. He hands the stack of printouts to the board president. The board president flips through the printouts and his face goes pale. He says the board is taking this seriously and they are committed to making it right. He proposes 3 emergency reforms. First, all snow-related violations must be documented with photos, timestamps, and weather data before any notice is issued. Second, all towing authorizations must be approved by 2 board members and the management company, and the vehicle owner must be notified in writing at least 24 hours in advance. Third, all vendor contracts must be reviewed and rebid annually to prevent collusion. He asks for a vote. All 3 board members vote yes. The room applauds. Then another resident stands up and asks what happens to Susan. The board president says Susan is no longer involved in any HOA activities, and the board is reviewing legal options. The HOA attorney stands up and says a statute citation read into the minutes that shuts the threat down. He reads Utah Code Section 57-8A-203, which prohibits HOA boards and committee members from using their position for personal gain or to harass residents, and violators can be held personally liable for damages. The room goes quiet. The attorney says the board is considering a formal complaint to the state, and if the investigation confirms fraud, Susan could face civil and criminal penalties. After the attorney sits down, the board president asks if I have anything to add. I stand up and say I appreciate the reforms, but I want to make sure they are enforced. I say the HOA has a culture problem where committee members think they can make up rules and punish people without proof. I say the reforms are a good start, but the board needs to communicate them clearly and hold people accountable. The board president says he agrees and they will send a detailed policy memo to all residents by the end of the week. Then a resident in the back stands up and says she wants to know if the tow company is being held accountable. The board president says the towing contract is terminated and the HOA is pursuing a claim for refunds and damages. Another resident asks if the snow removal company is being investigated. The board president says yes, and they have already admitted that Susan told them to stage photos right after the plow pass to make it look like residents were not clearing their walks. The room erupts again. Someone yells that Susan should be arrested. Someone else yells that the vendor should be banned from the city. The board president bangs the table and says the meeting is being recorded and any threats or harassment will not be tolerated. The board takes a 10-minute recess, then comes back and announces one more reform. They are creating a neutral dispute resolution process where any resident can request mediation with a third party before enforcement actions are taken. The mediator will be an independent attorney, not affiliated with the HOA, and both sides will have a chance to present evidence before any fines or notices are issued. If the mediator finds no violation, the HOA pays the mediation cost. If the mediator finds a violation, the resident pays. The board votes unanimously to approve it. The room applauds again. Then the board president says the meeting is adjourned, and he thanks everyone for coming. As people start to leave, 3 residents come up to me and thank me for standing up to Susan. One of them says she has been dealing with Susan for 2 years and never had the courage to fight back. Another says he is glad someone finally exposed her. Greg walks over and says the board is going to approve the mediation policy at the next regular meeting, and I should get the first case for free as an apology. I tell him I will take it. A week later, I get a formal letter from the HOA attorney. It says the board has concluded its investigation and found that Susan violated multiple sections of the covenants and Utah HOA law. The letter says Susan has been removed from all HOA positions and banned from serving on any committee for 5 years. It also says the board voted to reimburse me for any costs I incurred, including time off work, legal research, and document preparation. They cut me a check for $1,200. The letter also says the tow company refunded the dispatch fee and apologized for not verifying the authorization. The snow removal company was dropped and replaced with a new vendor who agreed to third-party audits. The plow driver was fired. The gate technician sent me a thank you note saying the new vendor is professional and does not play games. Susan tried one more stunt a month later. She sent a mass email to the neighborhood group chat claiming I doctored the security footage and the board was covering it up. She said residents should demand a reinvestigation and recall the board. The email was unhinged, full of all-caps accusations and conspiracy theories. Within an hour, the management company sent a cease and desist letter to Susan and removed her from the group chat. The board president sent a follow-up email saying any further harassment from Susan would result in a restraining order and legal action. Susan did not respond. A few residents replied to the thread saying they were glad the board acted and they supported the reforms. One resident said Susan tried to fine her for holiday lights and she is glad the nightmare is over. The reforms worked. I have not had a single bogus notice since the meeting. The new vendor clears the common areas without drama and does not red tag properties. The mediation policy is in the updated covenants and 3 residents have already used it to resolve disputes without fines. The board started publishing meeting minutes online so everyone can see what is happening. They also created a violation appeal form where residents can submit evidence and get a response within 10 days. The culture is changing. People are not afraid to question the board anymore. The group chat is quieter and less toxic. The emails are professional and fact-based. It feels like a normal neighborhood again. Susan moved out in the spring. I heard she bought a condo in a different part of the city with no HOA. Good riddance. Greg retired from his volunteer work but stays active in the neighborhood watch. He checks in with me once a month to make sure everything is calm. The gate technician still services the neighborhood and waves every time he sees me. My dad went back home once his heater was fixed, and he calls every week to ask if the HOA is behaving. I tell him yes. Everything is fine now. I still keep the evidence folder on my laptop, just in case. I still check my security camera every morning. I still take photos of my driveway after every snowstorm. But I do not expect trouble anymore. The board learned the lesson, the vendors learned the lesson, and the neighborhood learned the lesson. One person with a vendetta and a clipboard can cause a lot of damage, but one person with a timeline and a camera can shut it down. That is the takeaway. Document everything. Know your rights. Do not let anyone bully you just because they have a title. And if they threaten a lien, let them, because that threat looks terrible on the record when you prove it is baseless. The funny thing is, Susan tried to shame me and make an example out of me. But the neighbor fact-checked her instantly, and the whole thing collapsed. Karen tried to keep me on the agenda, But I put her on the record instead. She was outvoted so hard the room laughed. The HOA agreed to mediation with a neutral third party, and the vendor admitted Karen told them to stage photos. I showed the tow yard the paperwork and they refused to keep cooperating. A statute citation read into the minutes shut the threat down for good. That is how you handle an HOA that thinks it is above the law. You show up with proof, you stay calm, and you let them hang themselves with their own words. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you being here.